Afternoon and welcome to this next session at the Utilities and Telecoms Conference on strategies for customer expectations amid rapid changes in demand. So there's a couple of important points of context to this debate before we kick in. So one applies to collections functions in any sector really, and that's these kind of rapid shifts in demand seen over the past 6 months and the pressures and the severe pressures at times upon collections teams that this has effectively enforced. And the second is perhaps more sector-specific for energy firms. We've seen consolidation in this sector, particularly across a couple of the big 6 firms and the rest of the market. And sometimes this has occurred where new entrants have failed. Energy companies have taken on those new customers, and quite suddenly they're seeing that immediate uplift in customer volumes. And of course, there's all those expectations of customer service that those individuals will bring with them. So these 2 points form elements of the backdrop to this session. We're also going to be exploring coping strategies as these rapid movements in demand continue, particularly in this crunch period that we're in right now. So we're also going to look at what success looks like in practice for the longer term, dealing with these kind of simultaneous challenges beyond this period we're in right now. So we'll take in also some of the logistics required for the use of tech to meet customer expectations. So that's the backdrop, and I can let our panellists introduce themselves. So, delighted to welcome Terry Franklin from QUALCO Europe. And Terry, if you could relate to the audience just the nature of your role in interactions with these markets.
Yeah, sure. Hi, I'm Terry Franklin. I am the Business Development Director at QUALCO, and I'm basically responsible for interactions with our clients and helping identify how we can help them implement software solutions that manage the difficulties they get in the credit risk environment.
OK, thanks for joining us, Terry. And we also have joining us remotely Gary McCready from Dixon's Carphone. So, Gary, if you could also relate to the audience the nature of your role.
Hello. So I'm with Dixon's Carphone. If you don't know the business under those names, it's Curry's PC World, Carphone Warehouse, and Dixon's Travel. So we've got an amalgamation of brands. And I'm the commercial director for multiplayer and broadband, so our end-to-end sort of connectivity solutions for the business. Been with the business quite a while, and before we merged with Dixon's, I was the UK Finance Director for Carphone Warehouse as well.
OK, thanks for joining us, Gary. And I'll get straight into it, actually, on this question about demand and the peaks that you might have seen in the spring and how that's trended since then. Are you seeing this uplift, I guess, in the last few weeks or the last month or so, where perhaps customers are becoming more concerned about job security, for example? And I guess what would be interesting is one particular lesson that you've learned since around about March and April about the best way to kind of handle these fluctuations in demand.
So for me, as you pointed out, from March onwards, it was unbelievable the amount of queries and calls which we had from customers. It's exacerbated by the fact that customers couldn't walk into our stores and talk to somebody and have a face-to-face conversation, so that made more of a challenge. In terms of the learnings for us, really, it's about being flexible. So clearly, we struggled to cope initially with the volume of calls, but because our stores were closed, we were able to take some of our colleagues out to the store and have them support the contact centres. And then the second piece is this flexible working piece in terms of having somebody working from home with a laptop and a phone connection and able to help take calls and support that piece. Prior to that, it's not really a consideration for us. It was always about consolidating the contact centre, but having that flexibility has proved really important for us.
OK, thanks, Gary. And Terry, by virtue of your view, I guess, across different clients, across these markets, what have you noticed about where handling these fluctuations in demand has done well? And I guess a key thing is any observations on the speed at which some companies have been able to make these changes, whether it's upgrades, revamps, or just improving existing systems that they're using?
Yeah, I'd echo what Gary said in terms of the first priority was to get traditional contact centres out so people could work from home. So that was the first priority. And then the next priority is how do you enable customers to interact quickly in order to enact a payment holiday? So they're looking for solutions that allow customers to make those requests so they can be processed quite quickly without the use of human interaction, just to take away some of the demand in volume. So in the early days, that's what a lot of clients did, is it looked at ways that they could do that. So whether it was introducing a digital journey through an app or whether they would come into the contact centre and be routed via an IVR to an automated system where they could then process that payment holiday themselves.
Yeah, okay. And I guess for you, Gary, in terms of your observations on the past 6 months, even if you have time to make these, because it's been such an intensely busy period for everyone in the collections function particularly, what kind of questions from customers were the most difficult to answer? And how are those queries evolving in recent weeks? What new questions are customers asking?
I think for us, the questions have been very tough to manage, because in the past it's a very sort of traditional support and train and script on what those answers are. But for me, questions that come out from the customers are just uncertainty. So Terry talked about holiday payments and their sort of short-term interim gap. And now we're into the phase where people are understanding all they've done is move part of their debt and the timing of it. And so they're more worried about the future, what will happen post-furlough, what will happen to the economy, and then their position. We're also finding that there are people in this situation who it's unique to them. They've always been in full-time employment. They've never really had cash flow issues or not for themselves or their family. And now they're sort of transported into this place where it's uncertain and it's therefore worrying for customers as well. So it's harder to address some of those questions.
And is there one particularly positive aspect where, rather than as a business you're having to contact them, they're proactively contacting you? Is that still the case where customers are raising their own concerns with you first, rather than you having to seek that information from customers?
Yes, I think quite often, particularly that group we talked about, where it's an unusual situation for them, then they are being more proactive and getting in touch with us and reaching out to do that. And also talking to the customers sometimes is easier, because in the past it's been hard to call people back because they've been busy or other things, whereas now people are at home and a bit more accessible. And also those lines between the 9 to 5 or when you can speak to them, they're a bit more open to have those conversations with you about it.
Okay. And just moving on to a couple of points about the journey, I guess, that customers are taking. So I'll come to you on this, Terry, in terms of the changes that companies are potentially exploring right now, or changes that they're in the midst of making to meet this demand, including, you would hazard a guess, at optimising the journey using analytics tools, for example. What kind of pitfalls would you kind of guide them through to try to avoid as best possible? Okay,
so one of the biggest issues potentially is if you don't look at what that solution does in terms of the whole end-to-end journey. So, for example, if you introduce a chatbot and that chatbot is managing the first phase of the conversation with the customer, but the customer feels that they still need to interact with a human being, they're going to get frustrated quite quickly. So you really need to make sure that the end-to-end process is fully understood, that the customer journey is continuous, and that wherever you're introducing the new technology, it still flows within that whole end-to-end journey. What you don't want to do is create any additional frustration or stress for the customers. We spend a lot of time working with clients to make sure that we fully understand that end-to-end journey, so that when we're designing the solutions, we take into account what is it actually going to look and feel like for the end customer.
Yeah, and I guess the key challenge there would be presumably looking at the best points to take them out of the initial automated journey and into the kind of requisite interaction with a customer service agent. So what key challenges can emerge there, and what have you observed about how it's done well, where people are looking at the agitation, potential friction in the initial part of the journey, and moving them hopefully quickly to a resolution with a person?
So the key thing for me is making sure that you've got a constant feed of the outcome data of things that are happening with customers. So whenever you're interacting with a customer, there's a clear understanding of whether that's resolving the situation or whether they need to progress to something else. And then as you build up that behaviour, you can then use analytics to predict which way a particular interaction is likely to go, so you can start to be a bit more preemptive in the way that you interact with those customers. You may not have enough data to start with to make those kind of predictive interactions, so you can start with some simplistic rules. So just for an example, if your customers are interacting with the chatbot and they feel quite frustrated, you might see that there's a number of conversations going backwards and forwards, and just make a judgmental call that after a number of interactions where there doesn't seem to be any progress, that you jump out of that process and then back into an option where the customer can speak to an agent if they so choose. And it's just taking those things on board that really matters.
Yeah. Okay, and then Gary, is this something that you've looked at as well, the kind of the potential friction, I guess, in the initial stages of the journey, where you're trying to make it convenient, I guess, at the first interaction, but how to kind of move those customers into a more of a coherent journey where the issue can be resolved as fast as possible and the outcome can be provided?
I mean, that's correct, and I agree with the commentary from Terry. And it's in the past, there's been a real desire to try and move to self-serve for the customer, to have 24/7 support and convenience on the back of this piece. But now, as you said, it's about identifying what their unique needs are and trying to get to that position. Sometimes that requires conversation with an agent to advise and help on that piece as well, rather than just a lot of standard scripting, which we've done. And then the other part is just challenging within the business to move things forward and make that change happen far more quickly. So in the past, things have taken an awful lot longer, whereas it feels as though everybody's sort of in a similar place and understands the need for urgency and the desire to get solutions in much, much faster for a customer.
Yeah, and just one final point on this, Terry. Have you seen companies still, whether it's utilities, telcos, or further than that, kind of look at this with some urgency at the moment? Because lots of customers in transient circumstances, we're in this period now where presumably the uncertainty over income and job security can be prolonged for the next few months, maybe even a year in some cases. So have you seen that trigger, I guess, a level of exploration about where companies need to improve this initial part of the journey, but also ensure that they're looking at the holistic, comprehensive element of that as well?
Yeah, so there's a number of angles there. So definitely in terms of managing volume and being prepared, particularly in the early stages of lockdown back in March, as we mentioned earlier. But I think also then looking at business processes and recognising, so utility sector, for example, often there are touch points with the customer face-to-face. Those touch points are suddenly removed. So you've got potentially a field force of agents that historically have been out interacting with customers. They need to be retrained. They need to look and focus elsewhere within the business. So you can't take one thing in isolation. You've got to look at that whole process. But also then, when you retrain those staff and you put them into an environment where they're now interacting with customers in a different way, you're kind of upskilling that workforce. So not only have you got the technology to help, but you've also then got some additional resources that can help manage some of the demand that's going to come down the line. And the other thing that we've been doing with clients is really helping them to pull the data into an environment where they can analyse it and start to spot what's actually changing. And there are people that are now finding hardship, Gary mentioned this earlier, who historically have just never, ever been in that situation. And I can only see that kind of worsening over the next kind of 3 to 6 months as things like the furlough scheme unwind, etc. And the things that we've known about the customer base in the past perhaps aren't going to be as relevant in the future, just because different sectors are going to be impacted more adversely than others, and therefore we're going to have to put measures in place to help those customers.
Yeah, it does seem that way, because it's not just these big macro schemes that are ending, such as furlough, and despite that moving on to a very complicated system that some employers might not want to use. There's lots of government debtor protection measures all conspiring to end at the same time. So you've got to think that that has, at some stage, probably going to lead to another spike, I guess, in initial calls coming in from very concerned customers. Just one last question on this matter of chatbots, I guess, or other elements that companies might be exploring to use in initial stages of the journey. Is it a matter of, this might sound like a reductive question, but is it a matter of trial and error in most of those cases? Presumably there's lots of testing involved, but I guess they have to test quite quickly, I guess, because the demand is coming in so fast.
Yeah, so there's the traditional activity of designing something, testing it and implementing it, and then in a kind of an agile manner, making sure that it does fulfil the objectives of the business need or the customer needs. So the introduction of ways of quickly processing a payment holiday request, that's a fairly distinct process in its own right, so it's relatively easy to implement that, test it and prove that it works. But as an analytical purist, I would say that you should always be looking to champion challenge what you do. So whatever processes, whatever treatments or workouts you've got in place, make sure that you continue to have an environment where you can test and challenge that. So even if it's a very small proportion of the base that you take away offline and test with a new solution, then ultimately the results of that will determine whether or not you roll that out to a larger proportion of the base. I think particularly with this current situation and the people that are going to be affected, it's going to be really important to understand who is showing signs of stress early and how can you proactively get to those customers. So you don't just have a bow wave of suddenly, oh, we're all in trouble, but actually you're kind of getting in front of those customers and putting solutions in place before, whether it's regulatory driven or whether it's just the customer's own stress that's driving the inbound contact, you can help them manage that and resolve it more quickly.
Yeah, it does feel that, and that way the personalisation, I guess, of support is one way to describe it, because so many people in very specific circumstances that historically would have been good customers kept on repaying and no such urgent queries from them in the past. Is this something that you're looking at, Gary, too, the nature in which you'll have to look at providing even more tailored support, I guess, for people in very specific circumstances that are still quite changeable, I guess, in the next 6 months or so?
No, it certainly is, and obviously we want a long-term relationship with that customer. And in the past, they've been very valuable to our business, and so the customer lifetime value is particularly important to us. So we have to treat the customer with respect and in a collaborative way in partnership to support them through that and help them feel as though they've got a sort of tailored or customised plan that will get them from where they are now to where they need to be, and to maintain that sort of situation and that positive relationship in the future going forward. So you're right. If it's a more blanket approach or not, then it certainly doesn't work for us. We have to feel as though we're working with that customer, and also it's that cost customer, but also the household, and then the referrals that they pass on to other people. So having that sort of partnership approach is something that's really important to us.
And in terms of the practical elements of how forbearance and financial support will evolve over the next few months, I guess companies don't want to continually put a certain number of customers on payment holidays. It's too prolonged period, I guess, for some customers. So what are the practical ways and maybe the new ways of forbearance that are going to take part, or is it just using existing techniques but in different ways?
Well, I think it's an adaptation of what we have currently. So for me, the holiday, the payment holiday was a sort of very, very short-term, get me out of the next sort of 2 months issue. And then hopefully everybody will be back to work and life will be back to normal, and that certainly didn't happen. So now it is about understanding what their budgeting position is, what they can and can't afford to do, and working out the scheme from now going forward with that piece. There's certainly a worry back from customers to think that they've taken a payment holiday and actually all they've done is built up a problem for the future that they need to address and tackle. So I think some of the positions or some of the options are available now, but it's how it gets adapted to the customer.
Okay, yeah, it's a good point that there might be some level of complacency that had set in by the summer, I guess, and the government has kind of made indications of that when that started to ebb away, lots of customers might have realised quite suddenly that things weren't going back to normal by the end of the year, and that the issues and the restrictions and the effects on their income, for example, were going to be prolonged. And it feels like that is another catalyst, I guess, perhaps to demand and queries coming in about collections. Just a follow-up question, Gary, on the kind of spectre of regulatory updates. They've been coming thick and fast, particularly in the financial services industry, and we've seen them being active in the energy, water and telco sector too. But for you, how have you managed to meet these requirements, these expectations that keep on flowing in from customers while adjusting, I guess, to these fairly frequent updates particularly from the financial regulator, I guess?
You're right. So we're subject to a number of regulatory bodies, Ofcom, as well as FCA, and we have to manage PCI compliance and InfoSec and GDPR, and there's quite a variety. I would say that, to be fair to the regulators, that there's been a degree of sort of flexibility and some support as well, and understanding of where we are with it, rather than always taking a hardline approach. more conversational discussion to try and align on what the correct approach is in the position. And I've been very grateful for that piece as well. So it feels as though everybody is understanding what the biggest sort of situation and position is, rather than just taking a very, very strict hard line. So the example is having contact centre colleagues being able to work from home. Before, I think we would never have even considered that, because we thought it would just never get approved or signed off. But in reality, we were able to work a solution for that piece. So they have been more supportive, I believe, over the last 6 months.
Yeah, and just a last question, perhaps for you on this, Terry, in terms of where the analytics tools or other tools that companies are using that are really making a difference in helping them very quickly having to adjust to these new rules that are coming at them probably every couple of months at the moment.
Yeah, so this kind of goes back to taking that feed of data at the point of interaction with the customer. So whatever is driving the customer behaviours, whether it's new ways that they can save themselves some money, or they can introduce a new payment holiday, for example, whatever it may be, having those feeds on a daily basis, being able to data manage that in an effective way, to be able to build models that are predicting how those behaviours are changing quickly. And the fact that you take daily snapshots of that data means that you can fairly quickly build models that will predict how customers are changing their behaviour. And by doing that, then you can start to interact with them differently, or design new solutions or processes or treatments that are going to actually cater for that changing behaviour. And that's the key thing, is having your finger on the pulse effectively and recognising how those changes are taking place across the customer base.
Yeah, and I guess a key point there is that regulators will notice when companies are taking that proactive approach, I guess, to preempt where issues might emerge in future. They do seem to recognise that.
Yeah, definitely. And I think there's also a recognition that there's only so much money available to help customers. So yeah. I think businesses are taking tough decisions at the moment. I can help some of my customers. I can offer them a trust or a fund or something, and help them manage those repayments. We've had a period where disposable income's probably increased as a consequence of people not going out and spending as much as they had done historically. So no idea which of the customer base will have been prudent during that period and which would have thought, right, I'll go out and I'll spend that extra money on something else. So it is going to unravel, and it's going to unravel over the next 3 to 6 months, I suspect. But actually being able to proactively help the right customers and potentially to help more customers, so how do I make the funds that I've got available stretch further across my customer base, is going to be really important as well. So not necessarily who shouts the loudest, but who are the people that really do need the help. It's
interesting, actually, because there's lots of stats that are out there that show the extent to which people have saved and have been prudent, but it's knowing who those customers are is the important point. I think just one last question, more of a general one, really, slightly theoretical for you, Gary. If you could pinpoint one positive catalyst in terms of customer service that's developed since lockdown that probably wouldn't otherwise have occurred, or wouldn't have occurred so quickly, what would you put that down to?
The thing that jumped out for me, for us in our business, is that we've used a live web link. So in the past, we've dabbled with this. It's been quite niche. The take-up's been very low, but we found it's absolutely taken off unbelievably. So this is a situation where you will be talking to an agent and you'll be dialed in. You'll be video linked into them. They'll be based at their home. You as a customer won't be on video, but they will. And you just have this unique relationship with the customer instantly. So there's a degree of sort of authenticity or trust, because you're invited into the colleague's home. You can see them sat in the kitchen or in the spare room with the dog, and it just makes everything a bit more human and a bit more genuine. And find that we get a much closer relationship with the customer. They have a more honest conversation, and trust is particularly important for them. And take-up in the past was very, very low for this. It's quite niche for certain customers, whereas now it's becoming the norm for broader groups to use connectivity, to FaceTime or use Zoom for other things. And so customers have really, really taken it up. And the positive CSAT scores that we get, the customer satisfaction scores, are exceptionally high on the back of this piece as well. And all it is the difference between talking to somebody, not knowing where they are, which part of the world they're in, whether they're reading from the script, whether it's even AI generated, to actually you're talking to somebody who's sat in their home in a similar situation to yourself, who can sort of empathise more with you and and give you advice and recommendations on the questions that you've got for them. So I would say that's my one takeaway, is that the video link piece has been huge for us. It's taken off very, very dramatically, much more than we ever thought it would, and I can't see that going away.
Yeah, that's got to be a hugely positive aspect that's come out, the kind of mutual trust and assurance that can build up between customer and agent as a result of that. So, yeah, hopefully that's one of the positives that can be derived over a very kind of tumultuous 6 months or so. So thanks, gents. So I'm back in the studio with Terry and Gary on the line, and we can work through your questions that are coming in through Slido. So just to let everyone know, that obviously was recorded a few weeks back. I think it was around about the beginning of November. So lots has changed since then. So Gary, I'll ask you the obvious question first. Since Boris's announcement on the second lockdown, have you seen any notable spike in queries coming through in collections since that happened?
I think we're getting peculiar spikes in terms of volumes that come through. Just again because customers are uncertain, and the news keeps changing on a sort of a frequent basis, and they don't know, for us, Currys, PC World, whether they can come into store, can they not come into store, who's an essential retailer, who's not, can I talk to somebody face to face, or do I have to phone somebody up? So so I think it's leveling out a little bit, because clearly it's been going on for such a long period, but certainly we're finding there's a lot of confusion amongst customers and clients as to what they can and can't do, and who they can talk to for help or advice.
And do you have any discussions internally on collections volumes that you anticipate to increase in perhaps on a monthly basis or on a quarterly basis next year?
I think in terms of volume, some of it is linked for us. What happens to furlough and people on furlough, what's happening to the economic market, and then the uncertainty after that piece. Christmas is in retail known as the sort of golden or peak period, and without that activity and that support, I mean, there's a number of businesses that I believe will suffer quite dramatically on the back of that piece. So we're expecting people to be on furlough and then not be able to go back to work, their employer's not there or not able to support them for that piece. So I think it's going to be a very tough Christmas, and I think January, February, we could see an awful lot of people in trouble financially and spikes through that piece. Yeah,
I think late Q1 does seem to be quite an ominous period in that context. And just on another question on, because we've got breathing space coming in next year, lots of customers taking payment deferrals, and they might have multiple payment deferrals on a mobile product, for example, but also a mortgage and a credit card too. Do you have any concerns about bad debt levels, even that might be mounting up in the background and reach a crunch point at some point next year?
I think so, yes, and particularly because the sort of period we've been through, 9 months plus, is such a long time. So I think having a sort of a payment window or a holiday for 2 or 3 months is okay, and people can work through that piece. But certainly you're right, there's mounting debt on the back of that piece, and then also people who were considering what was critical or an account they had to pay. I think that sort of cut-off or threshold point of what you must pay or not is escalating up, and therefore there'll be people caught in the middle. We'll be one of them, where I think we will start to see some problems on the back of that.
So, Terry, I'll bring in your view now for your kind of whole of wider market view. Presumably, this second lockdown and the further regional lockdowns that are coming later, presumably would put the focus back on the need for agility, I guess, in collection systems. That was the case back in March and April. But firstly, Terry, do you have any observations on volume spikes amongst your clients, and your view on the need, I guess, for collections operations to be agile in the next 6 months at least?
Yeah, definitely. So interestingly, the whole of Europe's in lockdown, so we don't just see this in the UK, we see it everywhere. But the NPL markets have become very active. I think that's kind of a recognition that portfolios are getting more stressed, and they're expected to become more stressed. Clients want agility in terms of how they interact with the end customer. They want to be able to be quick to react to changes in portfolio segments and be able to differentiate how they treat those customers based on things that are changing very quickly. So we've had conversations going on throughout the year, but we're actually seeing now a lot of mobilisation of organisations wanting to invest. But that's not consistent everywhere. Because of lockdown, there are some clients that have put some of their activities just on a holding pattern whilst we wait to see what happens. Kind of a mixture of unwinding of the pandemic if we are successful with the vaccine rollouts, and also just in terms of where and when to invest. So it's a little bit of a mixed bag, but I definitely believe that majority of clients really want to make sure that they're prepared for what is undoubtedly going to be a challenging time over the next 6 to 9 months.
So just moving on to some Slido questions. One has come in about operations and call centres. So Gary, I might come to you on this. How do you see the future of call centres progressing and processing? Is it more efficient at home or in the office?
I think it's an interesting point, and I can tell you the story that's happened to our business is that we were wanting to ramp up the volumes of people doing this sort of shop live video support piece. And then our England stores went into lockdown, so suddenly we had many thousands of colleagues who could now jump on for that service. So we've expanded that. We've gone for a 24-hour support service as well, which we're sort of trialing and understanding and how that operates. So I think there'll be more of this piece sort of rolling out, and our business, like many others, are having to react to what's happening with lockdown and the change of status, and then trying to support the colleagues that you have as well. So we've had to be flexible in terms of who we put through to support our contact centre or not. In terms of working from home, if you're working on shift patterns and other pieces, then working from home clearly supports that as well. And if people have got good connectivity, then I think this will be something that will be sustainable and grow. The one watch out I would say is that people's sort of well-being and wellness is becoming a sort of an increasingly important factor, particularly for people who are working for us, but they're on their own and based at home all the time and don't have that sort of face-to-face contact. So these are some of the longer-term things that we're having to now sort of start to consider properly, and whether that is itself sustainable or whether you need to have sort of contact centre support as well for that.
So with the 24-hour support service that you've just mentioned, does that involve in it video calls between agent and customer, and would that involve vulnerable customers too?
Yeah, so it's a video connection on our part, and then it's a telephone call on the customer's part. So they get to see you, but you don't get to see them. And as I said, it's a trial. It's good because I think those boundaries of the sort of the 9 to 5 are becoming quite grey, and what's personal time or work time is certainly changing as well. So it supports that and people's need to be able to contact when it sort of suits them best. Whether this is a long-term piece or not, and whether we get enough supporting traffic overnight or not is a different question, and we'll need to sort of monitor that closely to see what happens. But I think it's certainly an expansion of what those sort of traditional working hours are.
It's an interesting point on the video calls, because I know that some utilities firms are having success with this. In the weeks that you've been using it, or the months, however long it's been, are you seeing a level of comfort amongst those customers who might be divulging personal circumstances or even vulnerable circumstances?
I think people are just gradually becoming more accustomed to it. So once upon a time, it would be very unusual to do a FaceTime type call. It might only be with your family. But I think over time, that sort of net is spreading, and people are becoming, and it's becoming more normal, and therefore people are more comfortable sharing information and sort of reacting and liaising in that way, and have more kit in the home, whether it's a phone or an iPad or a tablet or laptop or other pieces as well. So there's more ways for people to get access and connection. So I think it is becoming more of the standard.
Very much so. So I think we've got time for one last question, and I'll just ask for a concise estimate, I think, from the two of you. So coming to you first, Terry, we have a question that's come in from Slido. Do you see the tiered lockdown system leading to higher rates of defaults as people are potentially facing waves of difficulty?
I think different industries have been impacted in different ways, so it's difficult to say that a specific geography is going to be more or worse impacted. But if you're in the service industry and you're in high tier, I can imagine it's going to be more severe. So there will be some regionalisation, but it's also sector specific.
Yeah, it does seem that sector specific policies might become more common across different sectors. And your view, Gary, on the same question, whether you think the tier system might lead to higher rates of defaults as people face that prolonged wave of difficulty?
I think for us, we were quite concerned about what Tier 3 would mean. And now we found out that Tier 3 means that non-essential retailers and gyms and other locations will be open for business. I think that will certainly help the economy and then the people who work within it and who are employed within it. So for me, although we've got a tiered system, we don't have a tier where it's almost a virtual lockdown. And I think that will certainly stimulate the economy. And I think for me, that will help our customers as well.
Yeah, you have to hope so. I think we're out of time now, but thanks very much to Terry and to Gary. That brings us to the end of our formal sessions for the Utilities and Telecoms agenda. We've covered a lot of ground on vulnerability types, of vulnerability tech systems, data insights and managing customer expectations. There's probably too much to encapsulate, as a lot of these issues are quite fluid and transient, but we will have closing remarks with my co-chair Sandy in just a moment, so please don't go away.